it's sort of interesting as a contemporary builder to look at that and see it as this hybrid between face frame and flat panel or Euro style boxes. What was driving that? It's hard to say. I mean, I think a lot of it was there's a kind of efficiency to that, a kind of clarity about that. It's also a little bit easier to be built on site. So like a traditional face frame type of cabinet is much easier to be built in a cabinetry shop because the face frame has to be assembled and doweled together. And then the box frequently is made of thinner than 3/4 inch material for the sides. And they're usually the shelves or the horizontal elements in a box will frequently be rabbeted into the sides. And there's a lot of things that require machinery that isn't as easy to have on site. And so I think that it's possible to look at the construction or of the cabinetry in Wright's Kitchens and Baths and say, oh, this is oriented around being able to be built on site. And this is a quality that is found in a lot of the furniture in Wright's houses, especially post like 1910. Like prior to 1910, the furniture is mortise and tenon. It's very much in the construction style of arts and crafts. They're working with solid stock sticks and they're mortise and tenon into each other. And that really needs to take place in a professional cabinetry shop. Bathrooms are a little bit tougher because they're always oddballs with Wright's work. Oddballs in the sense that they can be a little bit awkward. They're surprisingly small by certainly modern expectations. And to the extent that they feel designed, it's usually some sort of wall condition. I'm thinking particularly of Taliesin West with the board and batten walls. And that's really kind of about it. They're certainly not the sybaritic retreats that they are now and in contemporary life. From what I can tell, he's one of the earliest users of plywood. And when he started using plywood, he was like in all the way. And he took advantage of both of its inherent physical qualities. In other words, this is an easy way to create a large plane. He took advantage of it compositionally. A lot of his furniture, the chairs and tables are very much planar compositions. That's the kind of animating or organizational principle behind the aesthetic. And he also took advantage of its structural qualities in the sense that you could glue to plywood at any angle, to the edge, to the face, at any angle, and have a relatively strong connection. In other words, you didn't have to do mortise and tenon. And this is one of the ways that plywood lends itself really well to site-built construction by semi-skilled workers and or carpenters. Is that it freed him and everyone else from this necessity of having to cut a mortise and tenon, which is a relatively skilled and labor-intensive process. Well, yeah, Wright is really good at creating this interwoven web that weaves together the structure, the decorative elements, which can include all types of millwork from trim to cabinetry to open shelves, and to the weaving together of the structural elements, the millwork, and the decorative elements. And so a piece of trim in particular, a piece of wood, could start out as trim in some regards, it's kind of a horizontal band, and then kind of all of a sudden take a turn and wrap around a pier and become maybe the base of the pier, or kind of hold the pier in place, or kind of create a decorative effect on top of the face of the pier. And so Wright was sort of a savant in this interweaving of these elements, where an element could start in one way and finish in a completely different way. In my class, I start with the idea that if a designer wants to get something from Wright or work from the world of Wright, they have to start in a very, very different position than we're in already, because we come from a world where we have a great facility in creating really interesting shapes, but we have a weak compositional abilities. And as a result, and I show them an early Wright chair, and I show that chair in comparison to an Eames like potato chip chair, and so this is an important kind of starting point to recognize that you have to start in a very different place if you're going to get something from Wright, because his work demands a facility in an area where we're all a little bit weak. There's a wide range of integration and differentiation between the parts. So sometimes individual parts are highly integrated and he uses them to create a kind of continuity. Many times it's a kind of horizontal element or something like that. But there's also very clear expressions of differentiation where things are merely adjacent to each other. One is separated through a very significant difference in materials or in how it's used. Excuse me. And at the very least, when you look at Wright's work, you see this interplay in the plan view of his buildings between rectangles that go one way and rectangles that go the other way. So he's using the directionality of rectangles as a kind of a vector tool, like to create kind of motion. It's important to me that a piece has a lot of visual activity. And my work studying Wright's work has been helpful because he has a lot of tactical compositional tricks that he uses that to a much smaller degree I've been able to incorporate into my work, because I'm searching for a kind of intense visual activity as well as a kind of an intense kind of beauty at the same time, so that these aren't just hyperactive pieces. I mean, I think this is where Wright's work his furniture gets a little bit weak in that it's very busy, and it's a busyness that isn't necessarily appealing or calming for most people. I have equal attraction to very interesting and intense built-ins, as well as kind of this freestanding, like really exotic freestanding pieces. And then also, because I'm a woodworker and I've been doing this a long time, I do a lot of just basic fabrication work, and I enjoy that too. You know, it's nice to have just a job with a clearly defined beginning, middle, and an end, and I don't have to kind of go crazy trying to make something really exotic. They've gone to the next logical step in an emphasis on shape-based design, and that is there's a lot of playing with the surface of the shape. So it's a very basic shape, but it has an interesting surface, both in terms of texture or materiality or color or something like that. In general, there seems to be still a lot of weak compositional activity. I think that there's a lot of value that's being left on the table in the area of composition. To the extent that there is some movement towards compositional activity, I do see interesting patterns. They usually have a digital kind of component, but they are interesting patterns, and they're usually just applied to the surface of something. They don't have a deeper relationship with the piece of furniture. They don't affect its typology or its structural system usually that much. But it's nice visually to see some patterns that aren't so unrelentingly predictable and have a little bit of activity going on. A pattern unfortunately, is a kind of a dead end with regard to composition because it's so prescriptive. In other words, you come up with a pattern and the pattern tells you where to go and what to do. And as a result, usually the pattern ends up not being integrated very well or in an interesting way with the piece. And, you know, if a designer is going to use an interesting pattern, the other 50% of the work has to be done on figuring out how to interface with that pattern, how to stop the pattern, what happens to the pattern when you have an opening, like for a door or a drawer. And usually I don't see people really problem solving that in interesting ways. Um, uh, and I think that's because we're all just kind of flabby, compositionally speaking. And once we fall in love with a pattern, we're reluctant to adjust it and change it and introduce another element, a transition element or something like that. We want to kind of overemphasize the pattern because it's usually pretty cool. So one of the qualities that's present in Wright's work that's really important is this quality of tight loose. There is a kind of a tight or clear expression of the overall shapes, but sometimes it appears there's a relatively loose arrangement of the individual components making it. This is more evident in like his buildings than his furniture. There's a lot of times where things don't line up. They go beyond each other, they overlap each other. And unlike, let's say, an international style building, you can kind of mess around with that stuff and the building is still essentially the same. It still has the same kind of energy. In other words, the energy of a Wright's building is not dependent on a super precise arrangement of parts. It's when you're in the world of compositionally based design, things can be a lot looser. You don't have to get everything to line up so precisely. And because many times when things don't line up, they create a third element. They create something new. There's a kind of a different shape, a different kind of compositional activity that can happen when they don't line up. When you line everything up, when you work with the grid in a very rigid way, you're kind of trapped that way. And, Wright worked with a grid, but he didn't let it determine everything. And on the other side of it, when he talks about breaking the box, he didn't throw the box out. He worked with the grid, the box, in a kind of loose way, and he understood ways to distort or dismantle the box or work in opposition to the box in small ways that would be kind of perceptually very significant. They could really change your feeling or understanding of space.